All right, so in this video, we're going to continue talking about the effects of the commercial revolution. And here we're going to spend time looking at the effects on poor people. So in the last video, we kind of looked at how the commercial revolution was seen by the rich people and what they did. And so now we're going to see how those things that the rich people did are seen and reacted to by the poor people. So one of the things that we mentioned in the previous video that was a big focus of our attention was the enclosure movement. Now, for poor people, the enclosure movement was not great. So for poor people, the enclosure movement actually hurt them. So best case scenario, you ended up working on your same land, but paying rent to a landlord. That was the best case scenario, that you just stayed where you were and now you're an employee instead of an independent farmer. Best case scenario, you stay in your home, you work the same land. That's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario, and this actually happened probably more than the best case, was that you ended up homeless. You ended up homeless as your village kind of disintegrated around you. And so you kind of had a few options at that point. You could become just a beggar, which there were a lot of. That was a pretty common occurrence. You could become a criminal, which again was a pretty common occurrence. Or you could move to a city. And that's probably the best of these worst case scenarios, was to move to a city. Now, the cities were not great places to live. So the major European cities were not ready for the influx of people that the commercial revolution caused. So major European cities were unprepared for the influx of poor, rural, used to be farmers. So they didn't have the infrastructure for the thousands of people that were flooding into the cities. And they weren't great to begin with, but as we get into the 1600s, which is kind of where all of this kind of starts to happen more and more, the cities become overrun with people. So just to give you a basic idea, let's look at Paris. Paris was, for lack of a better word, disgusting. It was a disgusting place because it wasn't built to have thousands and thousands of people flooding into it like what's happening here. So it was disgusting. Uh, this so it was unable to handle the number of people in it. So just to paint you a word picture, uh, the streets, they weren't paved, and in fact it was mostly just ankle deep muck. So kind of a mixture of mud, human waste, well, human and animal waste, and blood from the slaughterhouses. So all of that is just kind of out in the streets because there weren't really sewers for the human waste. You just kind of threw it out your window into the street. The animal waste wasn't ever picked up, and the blood from the slaughterhouses was kind of rinsed out into the street. So when you're walking around, you are walking around in this up to your ankles. At night, it was just completely pitch black. Which is bad for law-abiding people, but really good for criminals. So it was really violent after dark, which is kind of ironic considering Paris is sometimes called the City of Lights. Paris in the 1600s was super violent after dark because there was no light. London really wasn't any better. But at least in London, there was a giant fire in 1666 which burned the city to the ground. Which forced them to start over. It's not until like the mid 1800s that Paris is kind of torn to the ground and started over. So this is basically just a continuation of Paris being like a small village. It's just a small village that kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so when we get to like really important events in French history like the Revolution, part of the reason why the French Revolution succeeded was because Paris itself was like a maze of undocumented roads and alleyways that no one could really figure out unless you lived in these poor parts of the city. And so it acted as a way to protect revolutionaries, which is one of the reasons why they tore the whole city down in the 1800s to stop revolutions from happening. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Now, we also mentioned in the previous video that the guilds were losing control of the cities. They used to be able to control the cities in the medieval period, but now they're losing control of the cities because there are people who have more power and money that are kind of forcing the guilds to give up some of their control. Now, because the guilds are losing control of the cities themselves start to like take it upon themselves to police the city. which, and we'll talk more about this idea later. This means like basic administration, like basic services, like just the very basic things, and the morality of the city. But we'll talk more about this stuff when we talk about European society at this time. So, culture and society, we'll spend a couple of days talking about that. But cities are now starting to have to take it upon themselves because no one else is taking care of the people of the cities. In the cities, like basic goods are becoming more expensive. And that's because of inflation and a drop in wages. Because if all of a sudden there are a bunch of new people in the city, it's a lot easier for employers to offer less money to do work. People are desperate to find work. And so the employers will just pay as little as possible to get the same work done. And so inflation causes the prices to go up, and people are unable to buy the basic supplies because wages are dropping. All of which is going to cause some additional rebellions. So we see some rebellions and riots that take place because of the price of basic goods. So just to give you an example of one of them, it's called Midlands Rebellion, and it was kind of in the Midlands of England, so kind of in north central England. So north central England. And I bring this one up because it's got a kind of colorful character in it. One of the people leading this rebellion was a guy that was called Captain Pouch. And he said he was protected by his magical pouch. And he said the contents of it kept him safe. So eventually, Captain Pouch, who was one of the leaders of Midland's rebellion, was captured. And he was tortured and executed just like you would any other rebel. And it turned out all that was in Captain Pouch's magic pouch was a little bit of moldy cheese. So it was all a story, but it got people to follow him and believe him. So I guess that's what matters more. Now, this is mostly what we're seeing in Western Europe, just to give us a sense of what's happening in Eastern Europe. We're not going to dwell on what's going on in Eastern Europe, but what we see here is a peasantry, so the poor farmers. So we get a peasantry that is more controlled by the nobility. So in Western Europe, these people are becoming free. We're seeing a free peasantry. And that kind of causes them to move to cities and focus on trade and maybe manufacturing. In Eastern Europe, we see the opposite. We see that the peasantry is more controlled by the nobility, and that drives them into a bigger focus on agriculture. In some places, we're even going to see the practice of serfdom, which is essentially the same as slavery. It'll be treated as slavery by a lot of Eastern European nobles. It's technically not the same thing as slavery, but for all intents and purposes, it's slavery. Uh, just a couple of more points about like just regular life for people. We see a bunch of new crops that become daily staples in European life, particularly the potato. I know we've mentioned the potato before, uh, but the idea behind the potato becoming a staple, and that's thanks to the Columbian Exchange. The potato was calorie dense, nutritious enough, and it grew in all soil, and it grew a lot. So you could have a very small plot of land. It could be bad soil, but the potatoes will still grow. You could survive on just a few potatoes, and they're nutritious. They're not super nutritious, but you won't die if you eat nothing but potatoes. So, kind of compounding the kind of gradual urbanization that we're seeing in the late 1500s into the 1600s, we're also seeing an increase in population as potatoes keep people alive. And so we're going to see a surge past pre-plague levels of population. Which isn't necessarily a good thing. This could lead to some demographic problems down the road, but we'll worry about those when we get to them. Now, the last thing that we've got to mention here, and I'll be completely honest with you, I find this stuff to be dreadfully boring, so I'm going to try to get through it as fast as possible. But you might really find this interesting. So if you find it interesting, I can point you in the direction of other sources. But for me personally, I find this stuff to be really, really boring. And this is changes to banking and finance. So if you really like banking and finance stuff, sorry, I'm probably going to give this as little attention as I can because I just find it really boring. But basically, what happened was because of all the new money coming into Europe, there had to be changes to how money was accounted for. And so really, what we're talking about here is the birth of accounting as a trade. So before this, money was pretty much all coins, and the money was clipped. And so clipped money means that you kind of cut off or shaved off the edges of coins to make new coins. So you're kind of making new coins out of like shavings of old coins. And so you didn't want to have clipped money because it meant it was really old and it didn't have the value. So a coin had as much value as the amount of precious metal in it. So if a new coin, and I'm just going to draw little circles here. So if a new coin is that big and has the value of, I don't know, $1, just to kind of keep it in terms we're all familiar with, you might have a coin that's that big that looks like it might have been one of these in a previous life. All of this stuff has been shaved off, but it's still not worth what it says it's worth because it doesn't have as much gold or silver on it. If that makes sense. So what do? We want to have fresh money because fresh money is the money we want to spend all the time. We know it has the same value. So the question is, how do we ensure fresh money? How do we make sure the money we use is always fresh? And so the answer comes from the Dutch and the Bank of Amsterdam, which was Europe's first central bank. And a central bank is one that controls all the debt for a country or for a government and issues money. So that's what a central bank does. It controls all the debt for a government and it issues money for the government. Here's what the Bank of Amsterdam did. If you put money in the bank, they would issue you a receipt. And the receipt told you how much money you had put in. But the thing about the receipt was that it was guaranteed to be fresh, unclipped money. And so what you do is you'd walk around with your receipts from the bank. And so you would spend your receipts as if it was money. So you didn't carry around your money anymore. You carried around your receipts from the bank. They guaranteed your money. And if you ever needed to get your money out of the bank, you could take your receipts. Or if the person you gave your receipts to needed money, they could take them to the bank and get the money out. So how did they guarantee that there was always money in the bank? If you wanted to do business with the Dutch, and most people did because they were really influential merchants, if you wanted to do business with the Dutch, you had to put money in their bank and keep a certain amount in it. So if you wanted to do business with the Dutch, you had to keep money in their bank. That's how they made sure that there was always money in the bank and that it was always fresh money if you went to get it out. Now, there's one more thing about banking and finance that we need to talk about, and this is called double entry bookkeeping. Again, this is one of those things where I'm just going to kind of tell you what it is because I don't really think this is very interesting, but that's just me. So basically what double entry bookkeeping is it's like an equation. If money goes in or it goes out, you have to balance the equation. So if money comes in, you have to make an equal and opposite account on the other side. So there's basically two sets of numbers here. One with all the money going in, and the other side saying the money is coming in a different direction. So if the money comes in, you have to make sure that you account for it on the other side of the equation. This basically makes it really hard to falsify your books, your accounting books, because the equations have to match up, and if they don't match up, then it's obvious that there's something wrong, that there's something fishy going on, or you've got a bad accountant. And this is really important if you want to start issuing stocks, which the Dutch really want to do, because the stocks fund their trading company, which we will spend more time talking about in time period 2. So the stocks are going to fund their trading company, which are called joint stock companies. Okay, so I'm going to stop there mostly because I've run out of space and I'm tired of talking about changes to banking and finance. So hopefully that all makes sense. Honestly, I don't think it's going to be that big a part of the exam if it even shows up on there, but I just want to make sure I do my due diligence. So banking and finance, the Bank of Amsterdam, and double entry bookkeeping. I think the stuff about the cities, like the city life and the rebellions that took place because of the price of basic items, I think that is a much more important thing to remember, and especially the start of this process of urbanization. I think that's a very important point, and that's going to be with us in European history pretty much till the end of the course. So from this point forward, Europe is turning into a more urban place, and so a lot of the course is designed to account for this change from a rural agricultural society to a more urbanized manufacturing society. And it kind of starts right here with the reaction to the enclosure movement. So I'm going to stop there. This is Mr. Nissen signing off.